Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. And we are in 1 John chapter 3 this week. John I love the way he writes. We've talked about this the last several weeks, about how John, he'll take topic A and add a little bit of topic B, and then he'll take topic A and B and add in a little bit of C, and he'll take A, B, and C and add in a little bit of D, and he'll just keep going on. And so everything we've talked about is really important because John is continually referencing them and going back to them as he furthers his discussion in this letter. And so last week we talked about how, we looked at the section where he says, we have to reject the things of the world. We can't love the things of the world. But we saw that the word world is actually referring more to the things that are ordered against God. So God has this good creation that he makes, and it's good. There's good things in it, but there's parts of it that have been broken or warped or distorted to where they're against God now. And so those are the things that we have to reject. We can't participate in those. And that whole discussion was framed in the topic of Christ's return, the parousia. We talked about that word last week, about how that when Christ returns, he's going to change the order of things. He's going to put them as God intends for them to be. And so that means those things that are ordered opposite of God or against God are going to go away. And so we can't love those things. And so he ends that discussion. He starts it talking about that, and he ends it talking about his return. And he starts to introduce a little bit of what we're talking about this week. So verses 28 and 29 we talked about last week in chapter 2. It says, "And now, children, abide, remain in him, so that when he is revealed, we may have boldness and may not be put to shame before him at his royal appearing," his returning, his parousia. "If you know that he is righteous, you know that everyone who does what is right has been fathered by him." So he's starting to introduce child and father language here. And if you're familiar with the Old Testament, this should start to sound familiar. And if you're familiar with the New Testament, this should especially sound familiar. But it's kind of again, A with a little bit of B. He's taking that. He's been talking about subject A, about, rejecting the things that are ordered against God, rejecting the things of the world. And he's starting to introduce a little bit of child, father, kinship terminology. And now we're going to lean into that. So that's, like I said, the way John writes, it's so beautiful and smart, but it's very repetitive. So it's important that if this is the first week you've watched this, you go back and you watch the other ones, because those topics, the things he talks about, keep coming back up. So let's go ahead and read today's section. It's chapter 3. We're going to start at verse 1, go all the way to 10, and then we'll break down what John means by all of this. All right? So the first thing, so it says this: "Look at the remarkable love the Father has given us, that we should be called God's children. That indeed is what we are. That's why the world doesn't know us, because it doesn't know him. Beloved ones, we are now already God's children. It hasn't yet been revealed what we are going to be. We know that when he is revealed, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. All who have this hope in him make themselves pure, just as he is pure. Everyone who goes on sinning is breaking the law. Sin, in fact, is lawlessness. And you know that he was revealed so that he might take away sins, and there is no sin in him. Everyone who abides in him does not go on sinning. Everyone who goes on sinning has not seen him or known him. Children, don't let anyone deceive you. The person who does righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. The person who goes on sinning is from the devil, because the devil is a sinner from the very start. The Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. Everyone who is fathered by God does not go on sinning, because God's offspring remain in him. They cannot go on sinning, because they have been fathered by God. That is how it is clear who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Everyone who does not do what is right is not of God, particularly those who do not love their brothers and sisters." A lot to unpack here. And again, it's very repetitive term. Everything is a callback to something we've talked about previously. I have 2 sons. I had to name them. If you've never had to name somebody before, name a child, it's surprisingly difficult. Like, you think, like, you have all these names that you like, but to pick one you really like and want to name a person, it's a lot harder than you'd imagine. And there's starting to get a decent amount of science out there and research that shows, like, a person's name has a significant impact on the trajectory of their life. Like, it can really influence their character and their priorities. And it would make sense. I mean, that's why we choose names that we do. I mean, some people just choose names that they like, and, more power to you. But I wanted my kids' names to mean something, because my name means something. My name is Terrence Rex, and I'm named in part after my father, who is Terrence Lee. Even though he's always been called Terry, I've always been called Rex. I've never been called Terrence or Terry, and I never will. But at the same time, my parents named me T-Rex. And they deny they did it on purpose. They thought Terrence, they weren't choosing to name me after my dad, I guess. I don't know. My mom has a different story every time, and when she sees this, I'm sure she'll correct me again. But I got named T-Rex. That definitely had an impact on my life, because every time it comes up, it's always, that same conversation. But my dad's also, the person I look up to more than most. Probably more than anybody. And so to be named after him in part, that had an impact. It either intentionally or unintentionally, subconsciously, it gave me standards to shoot for. And so when I named my kids, I named them, Henry and Sawyer Lee. Sawyer Lee is named after my father. There's a little bit of a, this is what you're named after. There's an implied standard there. Henry is a strong name. There's lots of people out there with the name Henry that I want him to look up to and emulate. And names matter. And then if you earn a name, like if you earn a title, like if you're a doctor, that took work. That means something. And so to name something or someone, it matters. Like, it matters to a person what they're called, especially if they've got a mean nickname. That just destroys their self-esteem. Even if they laugh about it, like, it's still like it's saying this is what you are, right? And so John starts off this section again by calling back to what he just said, but still he starts the section off by saying we are God's children. That's your name. Right? If you are a Christian, if you are a Christ follower, you are God's child. You are part of God's people. You are his son. You are his daughter. By nature, we're his creation, right? Status quo, where we begin, we're his creation. But by grace, we become his children. Like, it's really the difference between just paternity and fatherhood, right? There's a lot of people out there who are fathers, like they produced children, but they're not really a father. They're just the biological father. They're just the paternity, right? They created children, but they're not really involved in the kid's life. A father is somebody who has a relationship with that kid, who pours into that kid, who tries to replicate themselves in that kid or to try to make that kid better than they were. A father is somebody who cares about how this person that they're part of raising turns out. That's what father is, and that's what God did for us. He did something to make us his children. I mean, and this is, the Bible is full of this terminology. The Old Testament, it talks a lot more in covenant terminology, which we've discussed quite a bit here at the church. But the idea of a covenant, you have the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. You have the Abraham's covenant, you have Moses' covenant, you have David's covenant, and then you have the New Covenant under Jesus. A covenant is basically creating family. That's what it really means. It's where it started out in the Middle East and Far East, where people would say, I can only trust my family, but there's other people out there I need to trust. And so how do we make them have that same level of trust? Well, we create what's called fictive kinship. We make them family. And, when you make those covenants and you read those covenants in the Old Testament and in secular sources, it's the language is, if you betray me, you're dead, because you don't betray family. And that's what we are now, right? And so God, by making us his children, he's saying, you are my family, right? And the stakes are crazy high. Not that he's going to kill us, but I mean, at the same time, it's like to reject the offer to be his child. I mean, it's not a good option, right? In the New Testament, it talks over and over, like John uses here, about adoption. We are adopted as God's sons and daughter. And so what John emphasizes in verse 2 is that not only are we God's children, but we're God's children now, right? Your self-worth, most scientists, most psychologists, I'm not citing any reference specifically, but I've read in several authors, Crabbe, Trent, Smiley, those guys all say the same thing, that the father figure in your life is the one that really establishes your self-worth, your self-confidence. It doesn't have to be your biological father. It doesn't even have to be a father figure. It could be just somebody who is that male father figure in your life. And I said father figure, but I really meant it doesn't have to be like a stepdad or a dad. It could be a grandfather. It could be, a Sunday school teacher, a coach, like whoever is that strong male role model in your life, like that person has a huge, huge impact on your self-worth. And so God says, you are my kid. And you're my kid now. Not some future event, not a Christ return. You're my kid now. The God of the universe says you're valuable enough to be his kid. Valuable enough for him to send his only son to pay the punishment you deserve so that you can be his kid. That should have an impact on our self-worth. That should have an impact on the way we see ourselves. And it should have an impact on the way we see others. And Christians should be the main mouthpieces for reinforcing that amongst each other. But instead we like to, I'm better than that person. I'm more valuable than that person. Or that person's way less valuable than me. We try to grade ourselves and put ourselves above each other and push each other down. And the reality is we're supposed to be God's hands and feet and mouth. And so we should be the ones that are encouraging each other and reminding each other that, hey, you're God's kid. And we're going to spend eternity together as one big happy family. Like that should make you feel awesome. And so John says that's what's important. And that's the promise, right? Verse 2 is the promise. As a matter of fact, this promise in verse 2, it's what everything hinges on in this entire letter. Everything John talks about before and after hinges on verse 2. So let's just read it again and make sure you hear the promise in there. It says, beloved ones, we are now already God's children. It hasn't yet been revealed what we are going to be. We know that he is revealed, and that when he is revealed, we shall be like him because we shall see him as he is. So we have a now status, and then there will be a future status when Christ returns. And so there's a promise of transformation at Christ's return. That's a big deal. That means there's a build up to that. And we're going to talk about that at the end. But what I want to answer first is, what are things going to be like when Christ returns? Right? What's eternity going to be like, both for the world and for us? We know in the biggest, broadest terms, God has three goals for all of creation. He wants a people to live in the place he created for them, to live directly in his presence. That's God's big plan. That's what everything's working toward. That's what he started out with in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1. That is where he's going to at the end, right? That is when Jesus returns. That is when all of this comes together, that God has a people in his place he made for them in his presence. That's the big broad terms. What that looks like specifically, John and all the other New Testament authors are pretty clear. We don't know exactly. All right? It's like looking through a mirror dimly, if you want to use a biblical phrase. We don't know exactly. But here's what we do know. We know that the world will look like this present world, right? This is God's good creation. It's corrupted, it's broken, it's distorted, but at its core, it's still God's good creation. And so it'll look like this, a physical this, only more. Because heaven and earth will be made new and combined into one. And it's, again, I don't want to go too deep into this, but heaven and earth are not like, earth is where we are now, heaven's where we go. That's a Middle Ages philosophy, theology. It's not biblical, right? You do not go to heaven. It's not in the Bible. None of the earliest church fathers taught it. I'll argue till I'm blue in the face. You don't go to heaven, and there's nowhere in the Bible that says it. We don't go to heaven. Heaven is simply God's space. Earth is our space. That's it. They're not, and the biblical authors didn't think that way. The early churches didn't think that way. Nobody thought that way outside of Gnostics, which you might remember from the first week of this study. Nobody thought that way except for them until the Middle Ages. So you want to be biblical in your thinking about what happens when we die. Don't say we go to heaven, because we don't. Heaven and earth are God's space and our space, and on Revelation 21, we see that they become one. God's place that all his people are going to be in is a combined heaven and earth. And we know that there won't be evil there. There won't be sickness. There won't be death. There won't be dying. There won't be corruption. There won't be all the evil, broken things, the things that are ordered against the way God wanted them to be. They won't be there. Other than that, we really don't know what it's going to look like. And that's part of what John says. And he says, what are we going to look like? Again, we don't know. We look like we know that we're going to be physical, right? You're not going to be a floating disembodied spirit. You're not going to be an angel, right? You don't go to hell and become a demon. You don't go to heaven and become an angel. Again, that's Middle Ages thinking. It's not biblical. We're going to be like this, just gloriously more physical. There won't be any sickness. There won't be any pain. You won't have any more elbow pains. If you have some deformity or weakness or, chronic illness or something, like that's all gone, right? It won't be this specific physical body, but it'll be a physical body. So that should put to rest anybody who's worried about, cremation or, losing an arm or losing a body part before you die. Most bodies are bones and dust. That's it. So don't get too wrapped up in it. Like the Jewish custom for burying people were to collect the dry bones and put them in a box. You don't have to worry about, your body being perfectly preserved in order to go to the afterlife. Like that's not biblical at all. But we are going to be physical. We're not going to be floating around. It's going to be like this, just gloriously more. And we know that we're going to be able to enjoy God's awesome creation without the temptation or the ability to worship it or get caught up in it or abuse it the way that we can now and we do now. So if you really want to know what we're going to be like after Christ returns, the clearest picture we have is of the risen Jesus. I mean, really, that's it, because he is the first of the resurrection. We see in the New Testament that several people are raised from the dead, but that's just a physical resurrection. Those people died again. Christ is the only one who has been raised in the new resurrection. He's been given the new body. And again, we don't have a super clear picture of it, but we do know this, that he looks like he's made to dwell in both God's realm and our realm, right? He's made to go in the invisible human or heaven realm as well as our earthly one. Like he's able to eat. He's able to enjoy the physical, so he's breathing, like, right? But then he's also able to just show up, which is something that's typical of heavenly creatures, right? So he seems to fit in both, which would make sense since heaven and earth become one. Exactly what that looks like, we don't know. Exactly what our physical bodies will be like, we don't know. And that's kind of John's point. But knowing that that's coming, that's what matters. That's the hinge. That's the thing that everything John's talking about before and after this hinge on. Knowing that this is coming, knowing that eventually we are going to be God's people, we're going to meet Jesus, that's what matters, right? Not that we know exactly what it looks like, but that we know it's coming and we live in light of that. And so from there, he continues on his argument. He says, in light of this, we have to be pure as he is pure. So what does that mean? Growing up in high school, we had foreign exchange students. And my neighbor was one of those people that they like to take them in. Like they like to have foreign exchange students. And so every time they got one or, our class was going to get one, it was always cool to kind of learn a little bit about that person's culture, right? To learn a few of those words and to learn some things that they liked in that country. I remember one year we had an Uzbek kid, and they love shish kebabs in Uzbekistan. I didn't know that before this, and it was cool to just like, hey, we're going to get really good at shish kebabs because, that's what he liked, Or, another guy we had was from Sweden, and Sweden, they love metal music. So I learned about some Swedish metal music and, that kind of stuff. But it was important to get to know a little bit before, so it wasn't just like, hey, weird person from the other side of the planet, welcome to Hillbilly Land. Like, no, it was good to know a little bit and to have some common ground there as best we can. Or think about this in terms of like getting a new job or going in for a job interview. You have prep work to do, right? Like before you go into your first day, you need to know some basic things. Like, yeah, you're going to learn a lot on the job. You're not going to know everything, but you got to know a little bit, right? Or if you go in for the interview, you got to know some things about it, or else you're not going to do very well, more than likely. We're going to meet Jesus, and we're going to spend eternity with him. We need to spend this life as preparation for that. That's John's whole point here. We are going to meet Jesus, and we need to live our life in preparation for that. And that plays out in a couple of different ways that we're going to spend the rest of this lesson looking at. And it boils down to verse 3, where he says, and all who have the hope, this hope that we're going to spend eternity with Jesus, all who have this hope in him make themselves pure just as Jesus is pure. So what does that mean? What does it mean to live pure? Purity means no sin, right? If pure is undefiled, it's pure. It's only one thing. Sin is the thing that ruins it, right? And so that's why he says in the next verse, everyone who goes on sinning is breaking the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. And you know that he was revealed so that he might take away sins, because there is no sin in him. Everyone who abides in him, Jesus, does not go on sinning. Everyone who goes on sinning has not seen him or known him. So this gets us to one of those parts in the Bible where people really scratch their head and really kind of misunderstand it. A lot of times this will be used as like a sledgehammer to beat over your head, trying to make you feel guilty for the bad things you did. And so basically you can read this and not read the rest of the letter and take it out of context and think like, oh no, I sinned, I must not be a Christian. Like, does sinning mean we're not a Christian anymore? To put it bluntly, no. If you remember from last chapter, again, that's why we always make sure we put this in context so that we don't forget what you would have read like 10 minutes ago otherwise. And chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 of this same letter, it says, "My children, I am writing these things to you so that you might not sin. If anyone does sin, we have one who pleads our cause before the Father, namely the righteous one, Jesus the Messiah. He is the sacrifice which atones for our sins, and not ours only, but the whole world." So John says right here, you're going to sin, but that's okay because Jesus takes care of it. I want you to think about it like this, right? In the church band, we try to blend. Jake tries to choose a blend of songs because we want to honor, songs from our past, from the church's past. And so we play a lot of hymns as well as, more modern and contemporary songs. The thing about a hymn is this. It was not written for a guitar, right? I play electric guitar. Hymns are difficult because they change chords a lot, right? Typical modern songs, they play like the 1-4-5. They play like 3 or 4 chords, and that's about it. Hymns play like all the chords in a mode, in a scale, and they change very frequently. So it's not like you can sit there and like kind of pluck it out. Like you've got to change chords very quickly, and it gets very difficult. Hymns, I play a lot of wrong notes. Like, I'll just be straightforward with you. Like, I play a lot of wrong notes. That's why I use so much reverb and delay, a lot of echo when I play hymns in church, because I play the wrong notes, because the chords are usually complicated. They're usually a bunch of them. Like, it's difficult. It doesn't ruin the song, though. If I play them over and over and play the wrong notes, that's wrong. But I'm trying to play the right note, and I might miss a part of it, or I might misplay the chord a little bit. There's forgiveness for that. That's what John is talking about in chapter 2, is that you are going to hit the wrong notes, right? You're going to sin. You're going to aim for hitting the right notes. You're going to aim for playing the chords right, but you're probably going to mess up, and that's okay because Jesus covers those. The other thing we do is sometimes Jake will say, hey, we're going to play this song in the key of C, all right? And then he'll show up like, I don't like that. We're going to change it. Or it's too low or too high for the singer. We're going to change it. And we have to change the key. So, you basically change the scales. I'm not going to get into music theory, but, if you play in one key, there are only 8 notes that work for that key, right? You change it, there's a different set of 8 notes that work for that one, and they're not interchangeable. Like, there's some overlap, but you can't play those specific 8 notes in a different key and expect it to sound good. If I tried to play the wrong key for the songs we're playing, the songs would be ruined. Like, it would be unlistenable. It would sound awful. That's what John is talking about here. He's saying that when you become a Christian and you choose to follow Jesus, the key changed in your life, and you have to play different notes now. You can't continue to play the old notes. You have to choose to play the new ones. And so he's not talking about that when we sin, when we play a bad note, that it's over as a Christian. He's saying that as a Christian, we have to be choosing to play in the right key of our life, because Jesus says we're playing in this key. You can't switch back to the old key. You can't. If you do, well, then you're not abiding in God, because God says, this is my key. These are the notes. These are the ones you play. You can't go back and forth. You have to play in the right key. And so as we live our life, God purifies us, right? Getting back to that purity idea. God purifies us, but we all have weaknesses and vulnerabilities. We all have those areas where sin can sneak up on us and get the best of us. We're weak, broken humans. We need Jesus. And so as we grow in our lives, we have to rely on God's power to purify us, yes, But we also have to avoid those weaknesses. We have to avoid those temptations. And they're each unique to us. What may be a struggle for you may not be for me. And what is for me may not be for you. But we have to avoid those weak spots. And it starts with being honest about them. Like there's this weird belief or an implied belief that once you become a Christian, all of a sudden, your weaknesses are supposed to go away. And it's just malarkey because it's not true. We're in process. I mean, that's clear throughout the entire New Testament, is that we are always in process, moving forward and closer to becoming like Jesus. That day of when he returns, we finally have that transformation take place. But between now and then, we're in process. And you can't stick your head in the sand and say, I used to struggle with this, but now because I'm a Christian, I don't anymore. Miracles do happen, but for the most part, we have to be smart about it. Every time we turn away from that temptation, every time we avoid that weakness, that's where the growth happens, not the other way around. And the other thing that we have to do in light of that is we have to seek brothers and sisters to help us. Christianity is never supposed to be a solo sport. It's supposed to be a team sport. And so, we rely on God's power to help us overcome those weak spots to keep ourselves pure, but we have to avoid those temptations and those weaknesses, and we have to rely on our brothers and sisters to help us get through it. And so to wrap all this up, to kind of summarize, we know that Jesus is returning. We know that he's going to get rid of the ordered things as they are that are against God's plan and instill this new order. And we know that when that happens, we will be transformed into something more, something eternal. And this should motivate us to live our lives in preparation for that, for spending eternity with Jesus. I'll close with this illustration I read in Tom Wright's commentary. He said, it's if you've ever noticed couples that are married for a long time, they start to look like each other. And it's not just like, you associate the two together. I'm sure that's part of it. But they physically change the way they look. And the thinking there is that the more they look at each other, the more that they subconsciously kind of adapt to those expressions and those nuances and those way of doing things and smiling and looking and it physically changes the shape of their face. Not dramatically, but enough to hey, they both smile the same way, or but hey, they both laugh at the same things, or hey, they both, they start to develop a similar face. That's the same thing we're supposed to be doing with Jesus in this life. Supposed to be looking at him so much that what he laughs about, we laugh about. That what he smiles about, we smile about, until we eventually start to look like him. Not physically, but spiritually. The way we live our lives. That people can see Christ in us. I hope this week was especially helpful and encouraging to you and cleared up some of that guilt. That's my biggest prayer, is that whole guilt thing just goes away. That the only thing that we have in our lives guilt-wise is a godly guilt that helps us live a more pure life. But I hope this week was encouraging to you. If you have any questions, as always, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.